The gunshot crack of bone echoed across the canyon, just as the sun began its descent behind the Sierra ridgeline. And Lily Carrington realized with cold certainty that she was 7 miles from Wallace, Idaho, with a shattered ankle and no one who knew where she had gone. She had been reaching for a specimen of what she suspected was a rare variant of evening primrose, the kind of discovery that might finally convince the California Academy of Sciences that a woman could contribute meaningfully to botanical research. When the outcropping beneath her boot gave way, the limestone crumbled like stale bread, and she fell hard against the scree slope, her leg twisting at an angle that sent white lightning through her vision. For several minutes she simply lay there, pressing her forehead against the cool stone, breathing through waves of nausea while her specimen notebook fluttered away down the hillside. When she finally gathered the courage to look, her left ankle had already begun to swell inside her leather boot, the flesh pressing against the laces with alarming urgency. She tried to stand, made it halfway to her feet, and collapsed again with a strangled cry that scattered a pair of ravens from the juniper above. The pain was extraordinary, a living thing with teeth. Lily had always prided herself on practicality, on the kind of level-headed thinking that had allowed her to travel alone through the territories cataloging plant species, while other women her age planned wedding trousseau. At 24, she had published 2 papers under a male pseudonym, survived a flash flood in Nevada, and once talked her way out of a confrontation with a territorial grizzly by remaining absolutely motionless for 47 minutes. But this was different. This was bone and distance, and the simple mathematics of survival. She had left Wallace before dawn, telling the boarding house proprietress only that she would return by supper. No one would begin searching until tomorrow at the earliest, and by then the night temperatures would have dropped below freezing. Her canteen was half empty. The sun was setting. She tried once more to stand, using a twisted manzanita branch as a crutch, and managed 3 agonizing steps before her vision tunneled to a pinpoint, and she had to sit down hard on a boulder. That was when she heard the horse. The sound came from higher up the canyon, the steady clip of shod hooves on stone, and Lily felt something unclench in her chest. She called out, her voice cracking from disuse and pain, and called again louder. The hoofbeats paused, then changed direction, growing closer. The man who rode into view looked like he had been assembled from the landscape itself. All sun, weathered leather, and dust, sitting his buckskin gelding with the kind of ease that spoke of years in the saddle. He was perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of creek water under cottonwoods. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, her awkward position on the rock, the unnatural angle of her boot, the scattered contents of her collecting bag, and swung down from his horse without a word. "Broke it?" he asked, kneeling beside her, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, warm as wood smoke. "Yes," Lily managed. "I was foolish. I was reaching for a specimen and the rock gave way." He nodded as if she had said something perfectly reasonable, then carefully unlaced her boot. Even through the leather, Lily could see the swelling, and when he eased the boot off with practiced care, she had to bite her lip hard enough to taste copper. Her ankle had turned a spectacular purple, swollen to nearly twice its normal size. "That is broken," he confirmed, sitting back on his heels. "You are a long way from town." 7 miles, Lily said. "Perhaps a bit more." The cowboy looked at the darkening sky, then back at her, making some kind of calculation. "Can you ride?" he asked. She tried to imagine hoisting herself into a saddle, putting any weight at all on the ruined ankle, and shook her head. "I do not think so." "All right then," he said, and before she could ask what he meant, he had gathered her scattered belongings, securing them in his saddlebag with efficient movements, then returned to crouch beside her. "I am going to carry you. It will hurt. I am sorry for that." "You cannot carry me 7 miles," Lily protested, even as he was sliding one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back. "That is impossible." "Yes, madam," he agreed mildly, lifting her as if she weighed no more than her specimen bags, and settled her carefully against his chest before she could marshal further arguments. The shift sent fresh agony screaming through her ankle, but he held her steady until the worst of it passed, then began walking, leading his horse with his free hand. "What is your name?" Lily asked when she could speak again. Being carried was intensely strange, being held this close to a man she had never met, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the hard muscle of his arms beneath her. "Jackson Fuller," he said. "I run cattle on the East Range, or I am trying to, and you, Lily Carrington. I am a botanist." "Or I am trying to be." She felt rather than saw his smile. "Seems we are both in the trying business, Miss Carrington." They fell silent after that, and Lily was grateful for it. The pain made conversation difficult, and there was something oddly intimate about being carried, something that felt like it required silence. Jackson walked with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man who knew exactly what his body could endure, never stumbling on the rough terrain, adjusting his grip on her only to avoid the worst jolts. His horse followed behind like a dog, reins loose over its neck. The sun dropped below the ridgeline, painting the canyon walls gold and amber and finally deep purple as the stars began to emerge. Lily drifted in and out of pain-hazed awareness, sometimes conscious only of the rhythm of Jackson's steps, the warmth of his body against the growing cold, the faint scent of sage and horse and honest sweat. Once she apologized for being a burden, and he said, "No burden, madam," as if he carried injured botanists out of the wilderness every week. The temperature dropped steadily as full dark settled over the canyon. Lily began to shiver despite Jackson's warmth, and he paused only long enough to drape his coat over her, heavy canvas still warm from his body, before resuming that steady, relentless pace. She tried to protest, knowing he must be cold now himself, but he shook his head. "You need it more," was all he said, and kept walking. Hours passed. Lily lost track of time, measuring the journey only in the slow wheel of stars overhead and the unchanging rhythm of Jackson's breathing. Her ankle throbbed with each step, but she bit down on any sound, unwilling to add to his burden. She could feel the strain in his arms now, the slight tremble in his muscles, but his pace never slowed and he never once complained. How much farther? She asked at some point, her voice barely a whisper. 3 miles, maybe less, Jackson said, and though she could hear the weariness in his voice, there was no resentment in it, only patient endurance. "You should rest," Lily said. "Put me down for a while." "We keep moving. We will have you to a doctor before midnight," he replied. "Rest now. We might not make it before dawn, and that ankle needs tending soon." So they kept moving, through the long, cold dark, and Lily found herself studying his face in the starlight, the strong line of his jaw, the concentration in his expression, the way he watched the ground ahead of them with absolute focus. There was something extraordinary about him, she thought hazily, something beyond the simple fact of his strength. He had found a stranger in pain, and without hesitation, without complaint, without even considering the cost to himself, he had simply begun carrying her home. When the lights of Wallace finally appeared in the distance, small and warm as fallen stars, Lily felt Jackson's arms tighten fractionally around her. "Nearly there," he murmured, and she realized with a start that he was reassuring her, as if she were the one who had walked 7 miles in the dark carrying another person. The town was mostly dark when they arrived, but Jackson carried her directly to Dr. Morrison's house, kicking the gate open and climbing the porch steps without pause. The doctor, roused from his bed, took one look at Lily's ankle and ushered them inside, directing Jackson to lay her on the examination table in his office. Only, when Jackson finally set her down, his arms releasing her with visible reluctance, did Lily see what the journey had cost him. His shirt was dark with sweat despite the cold, his face drawn with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly as he stepped back. But when Dr. Morrison asked if he needed anything, Jackson just shook his head. "See to Miss Carrington," he said. "I will wait." Dr. Morrison examined her ankle with gentle efficiency, confirming that it was indeed fractured, though cleanly, and would heal well with proper rest. He splinted it carefully, gave her laudanum for the pain, and informed her that she would be off her feet for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. "You are fortunate Mr. Fuller found you," the doctor said, washing his hands in the basin. "Another night out there would have been very bad indeed." "I know," Lily said softly, looking past him to where Jackson stood by the door, waiting with that same quiet patience he had shown through all those miles. "I am very fortunate." Dr. Morrison wanted to keep her overnight for observation, but the boarding house where Lily had been staying was full, and in any case, she could not manage stairs with the splint. It was Jackson who solved the problem, speaking up from his position by the door. "My place is not far," he said. "She could stay there until she is well enough to travel. I have a spare room. It would be proper." Dr. Morrison frowned. "You live alone, Jackson. That would hardly be appropriate." "More appropriate than her sleeping in my waiting room," Jackson replied mildly. "And I do not have time to help her find somewhere else. I have to be back at the ranch before dawn. My foreman is bringing the herd down for the auction in 3 days, and I need to be there." The doctor and Jackson looked at each other for a long moment, some unspoken communication passing between them, and then Dr. Morrison sighed. "I suppose it is the most practical solution. But Miss Carrington, you should know that Mr. Fuller is a perfectly respectable gentleman, if a bit rough around the edges." "He carried me 7 miles without complaint," Lily said, the laudanum making her tongue loose and honest. "I think I can trust him with a spare room." So Jackson carried her one more time, out to his horse and up into the saddle, climbing up behind her and settling her carefully against his chest. The ride to his ranch was blessedly shorter than their walk from the canyon, only a few miles east of town, and Lily drifted in a laudanum haze, barely aware of the landscape passing by. Jackson's house, when they reached it, was small and weathered but well maintained, a simple cabin with a barn and several corrals nearby. He carried her inside, lit a lamp, and settled her on a bed in what was clearly the only bedroom, then disappeared before she could protest. When he returned, he had blankets and a pillow, clearly intending to sleep elsewhere. "This is your room," Lily said, trying to sit up. "I cannot take your bed." "You can and you will," Jackson said firmly, the first time she had heard anything like command in his voice. "You need proper rest." "I have slept in worse places than a good couch." He paused at the door, his face shadowed in the lamplight. "There is water by the bed and a chamber pot beneath it if you need it. I will be up before dawn to ride out to the range, but I will leave food prepared and wood for the fire." "Will you be all right alone?" "Yes," Lily said, though she was not at all sure. "Thank you, Mr. Fuller, for everything." "Jackson," he corrected gently. "And you are welcome, Miss Carrington. Sleep well." He closed the door behind him, and Lily lay in the darkness of a stranger's bedroom, her ankle throbbing despite the laudanum, and wondered what exactly she had gotten herself into. She woke to pale dawn light and the sound of someone moving quietly in the other room. When she managed to sit up, pain shooting through her ankle despite its immobilization, Jackson appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her movement. "How is the pain?" he asked, crossing to the bedside with a cup of water. "Manageable," Lily lied, accepting the water gratefully. Her mouth tasted like copper and dust. Jackson gave her a look that suggested he did not believe her but was too polite to say so. "There is bread and butter on the table, and I have left a pot of stew on the stove that you can heat for lunch and dinner. I will be back tomorrow evening." "Will you manage until then, tomorrow evening?" Lily repeated, alarmed. "You are leaving for that long?" "The herd is 20 miles out," Jackson explained, already moving toward the door, clearly pressed for time. "I have to bring them down for the auction in Boise. It is a 2-day drive and the auction is the day after. I should be back in 3 days, 4 at most." He paused, guilt crossing his face. "I am sorry to leave you alone like this, but if I miss this auction, I lose the ranch. I am behind on the mortgage, and this sale is the only thing that will keep the bank from foreclosing." Lily felt her stomach drop. "How far behind are you on the mortgage?" "Far enough," Jackson said grimly. "The herd will cover it, but only if I get top price, and that means getting them to Boise in prime condition. Every hour counts." "Then you should not have carried me," Lily said, horror washing over her. 7 miles, Jackson. How many hours did that cost you?" He looked at her with genuine surprise. "What would you have had me do? Leave you to freeze? You could have ridden to town, brought back help, which would have taken just as long and left you alone in the dark for hours," Jackson pointed out. "Miss Carrington, I made the choice I could live with. The ranch will survive or it will not, but either way, I will know I did the right thing." Before Lily could respond, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and she heard the sound of his horse leaving at a gallop. She lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. He had sacrificed hours he could not afford to save her, and now he was racing against time itself to save his ranch. The simple mathematics of it were devastating. If he lost the auction, lost the ranch, it would be because he had chosen to help her instead of riding straight for his herd. Lily spent the first day doing very little except sleeping and trying not to move her ankle. Jackson had left his home remarkably tidy for a bachelor rancher. Everything in its place, no dust on the surfaces. She found herself studying the room, learning him through his possessions. The row of books on the shelf, surprising in their variety, everything from agricultural manuals to poetry. The careful mending on the curtains. The photograph on the mantel of a young couple who must have been his parents, both dead if he lived here alone. By the second day, she was going mad with inactivity and guilt. She managed to lever herself out of bed using the splint as a kind of peg leg, hopping to the main room and collapsing on the couch, where Jackson had clearly been sleeping, the blankets still tangled from his last night there. The stew he had left was excellent, rich with vegetables and beef, and she heated it carefully, rationing it to last. On the third day, restless and desperate to do something useful, Lily began exploring the property. She could not go far, managing only to hop to the porch and then, with great effort, to the edge of the yard. But what she saw there made her forget her ankle entirely. Jackson's ranch was situated in a small valley, sheltered by hills on 3 sides, and those hills were absolutely covered in a plant Lily recognized with a shock of awe. It was echinacea, purple coneflower, but a variety she had never seen before, with petals of an unusual deep violet and centers that were nearly black. More importantly, it was growing in absolutely massive quantities, entire hillsides thick with the distinctive flowers. Lily's heart began to race. Echinacea was being researched as a medicinal plant, its roots used by indigenous peoples for everything from infections to snake bites, and the medical establishment was just beginning to recognize its value. A concentrated supply like this, particularly an unusual variety, could be worth a fortune to pharmaceutical companies in the East. She hopped back inside, found her specimen bag where Jackson had carefully placed it on a shelf, and retrieved her notebook. Her hands were shaking as she began to sketch and document what she had seen, making notes on the density of growth, the unusual coloration, the ideal harvesting conditions. If she was right about this, if the variety was as potent as its appearance suggested, Jackson Fuller was sitting on a gold mine and did not even know it. When Jackson returned on the fourth day, riding in at sunset with exhaustion written in every line of his body, Lily was waiting on the porch despite the pain it cost her to get there. He dismounted slowly, moving like a man twice his age, and tied his horse before climbing the steps. "How did it go?" Lily asked, though she could read the answer in his face. "Not well," Jackson admitted, sinking onto the porch step beside her chair. "The buyers were looking for bigger herds, better quality. I got a fair price, but not enough. I am still short by $200 and the bank will not extend the loan again." "When do you have to pay?" "End of the month, 3 weeks." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I am sorry. I know this is not your problem. How are you managing? How is the ankle?" "Never mind my ankle," Lily said impatiently. "Jackson, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The hills around your ranch are covered in echinacea, a medicinal plant that is becoming extremely valuable in the East. I have been studying it for years, and the variety you have growing here is remarkable. If we can harvest and process it properly, you could sell it for easily 10 times what you would make from cattle." Jackson looked at her blankly. "The purple flowers, those are weeds." "Those are medicine," Lily corrected. "And they are your salvation if you will trust me." She pulled out her notebook, showing him her sketches and calculations. "I have contacts at pharmaceutical companies in San Francisco and Boston. If I send them samples with my analysis, they will buy everything you can harvest. But we have to move quickly. The bank will not wait, and the plants need to be harvested soon, or they will go to seed and lose potency." "You are telling me," Jackson said slowly, "that I have been riding past a fortune in medicinal weeds for 5 years while I struggled to keep cattle alive in the desert." "That is exactly what I am telling you." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the hills that were painted gold and purple in the sunset light. When he spoke again, his voice was rough. "Why would you do this for me? You do not owe me anything." "You carried me 7 miles, Lily said simply. "You sacrificed time you could not afford, and you never once complained. You gave up your bed, your privacy, your security for a stranger. This is me carrying you back." Jackson turned to look at her then, really look at her, and something shifted in his expression, something warm and wondering that made Lily's breath catch. "You are extraordinary," he said quietly. "I am a botanist who broke her ankle," Lily replied, but she could not look away from his eyes, creek water green in the fading light. "You are the extraordinary one, Jackson Fuller." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of frantic activity. Despite her injury, Lily directed the operation from the porch, teaching Jackson and 2 hired hands how to identify the most potent plants, how to harvest the roots without damaging them, how to dry and process them properly. She wrote letters to her contacts, sent samples by express mail, and negotiated prices that made Jackson go pale when she showed him the figures. They worked from dawn until dark, and in the evenings, when the hired hands had gone home and the hills were quiet, Jackson would carry Lily inside and they would eat dinner together, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that he had inherited the ranch from his father, that he had been trying to make it profitable for 5 years with little success, that he had nearly given up a dozen times. He learned that she had left a comfortable home in Boston to pursue botanical research, that her family thought she was mad, that she had been publishing papers under a male pseudonym because no journal would accept work from a woman. "That is criminal," Jackson said, genuine anger in his voice. "Your work is brilliant. Anyone reading it should know that, regardless of who wrote it." "The world is not set up to be fair," Lily replied, but his indignation warmed her more than she wanted to admit. As her ankle healed and the harvest progressed, Lily found herself watching Jackson with increasing frequency, noticing the way he moved, the quiet competence of his hands, the patience with which he approached every task. He was unlike any man she had ever met, utterly without pretense or ego, content to follow her instructions without question, because he recognized her expertise. When she explained the chemistry of alkaloids and their medicinal properties, he listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions. And he was still unfailingly kind, carrying her whenever she needed to move beyond her limited hopping range, always asking first, always careful of her injured ankle, never making her feel like a burden despite the obvious extra work she created. "You know," Lily said one evening as he set her down on the couch after carrying her in from the porch, "you really are the most patient man I have ever encountered." "Cattle ranching teaches patience," Jackson said, but he smiled as he said it, and his hands lingered on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "You cannot rush a cow, still. Most men would have complained constantly about having an invalid woman underfoot for nearly a month." "Most men are fools," Jackson replied, and the way he looked at her made Lily's pulse quicken. The morning the bank payment came due, Jackson rode into Wallace with a bank draft that covered not just the mortgage payment but 6 months of payments in advance, with enough left over to make improvements to the ranch and hire permanent help. The pharmaceutical company in San Francisco had bought the entire first harvest and contracted for ongoing supply, offering prices that transformed Jackson from a struggling rancher into a genuinely prosperous businessman overnight. When he returned, Lily was waiting on the porch again, her ankle now healed enough that she could walk with only a slight limp. He climbed down from his horse and simply stood there, looking at her with an expression that made her heart turn over. "It is done," he said. "The ranch is secure." "Because of you." "Because of both of us," Lily corrected, but Jackson was already crossing the yard, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. "Lily Carrington," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I have spent the last month falling in love with you. I know I have no right to say so. You are educated and sophisticated and destined for great things, and I am a cowboy who can barely read poetry without moving my lips. But I have to tell you before you leave. I have to tell you that these weeks with you have been the best of my life, and I will never forget them, no matter how long I live." Lily felt tears prick her eyes, joy and relief and something fiercer flooding through her. "You read poetry?" she asked, her voice unsteady. Jackson blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "What? You said you can barely read poetry without moving your lips, but you read it. You have Whitman and Dickinson on your shelf." "Well, yes," Jackson admitted, looking embarrassed. "I like poetry. But that is not the point I was trying to make." "The point," Lily said, standing up despite the twinge in her ankle, "is that I have also spent the last month falling in love with you. You are the kindest, most patient, most genuinely good man I have ever met, and I think you are severely underestimating yourself if you believe education is the same as worth." Jackson stared at her. "You love me." I have been trying to figure out how to tell you without sounding desperate, Lily admitted. I was planning a whole speech about how I could continue my botanical work from here, how the Echinacea research alone could occupy me for years, how I've grown fond of Idaho. But yes, Jackson, I love you. I think I started loving you somewhere around mile 4 when you were carrying me through the dark and you said no burden like you actually meant it. I did mean it, Jackson said. And then he was kissing her, his hands gentle on her face, and Lily forgot about her ankle, about the ranch, about everything except the warmth of his mouth, and the way her heart seemed to expand until it filled her entire chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know you might want to go back to Boston, but Lily, marry me. Stay here. We will build a life together, you with your plants and me with the ranch, and we will be so happy." "Yes," Lily said, laughing through tears. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony in Wallace, with Dr. Morrison serving as witness and the boarding house proprietress weeping happy tears in the front row. Lily wore a simple dress of cream linen. Jackson wore his best suit, and when he promised to love and cherish her all the days of his life, Lily believed him absolutely. The years that followed were marked by work and discovery and deep contentment. Lily established herself as one of the foremost experts on medicinal plants of the American West, publishing papers under her own name now, with Jackson listed as her research partner for his intimate knowledge of the land. The Echinacea harvest became a profitable secondary business for the ranch, and they eventually expanded into other medicinal plants, creating an entire botanical garden on the hillside behind the house. Their first child, a boy they named Caleb, arrived 2 years after their wedding, born healthy and loud in the same bedroom where Lily had spent her first night on the ranch. Jackson held his son with the same patient gentleness he had shown carrying Lily through the dark, and she watched him rock the baby and felt her heart swell with love all over again. 2 years later came another boy, James, followed 3 years after by a daughter they named Eleanor. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, new rooms added on, a proper laboratory built for Lily's research, a larger barn for the expanding cattle operation. They hired help, both for the ranch work and the harvesting, and the place that had nearly been lost to foreclosure became a thriving center of both agricultural and scientific excellence. Lily never forgot that first night, the sound of Jackson's steady breathing as he carried her through the dark, the way he had sacrificed everything to help a stranger. She never stopped being grateful for the chance rockfall that had brought her into his life, though she would not recommend ankle breaking as a courtship strategy to anyone who asked. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they stood together on the porch at sunset, watching Caleb and James chase each other through the yard while Eleanor picked flowers in the medicinal garden, her small hands careful not to damage the roots the way her mother had taught her. "You ever regret it?" Jackson asked quietly. "Staying here instead of going back to Boston. You could have had a position at the academy by now, recognition, acclaim." Lily turned to him, this man who had carried her 7 miles without complaint, who read poetry with moving lips, who looked at her like she hung the moon every single day of their lives together. "I have everything I ever wanted," she said simply. "A partner who respects my work, children I adore, research that matters, and a home I love. What more could acclaim possibly add?" Jackson pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, and they stood there in comfortable silence as the sun painted the hills purple and gold. In the distance, the Echinacea was blooming, entire hillsides of it, a living reminder that fortune can come from the strangest places, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries are not the plants we find, but the people who carry us home. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Lily sat in her laboratory cataloging the day's specimens while Jackson reviewed the ranch accounts at the desk beside her. It was a scene they had repeated countless times over the years, working side by side in companionable silence, and yet it never grew old. "I was thinking," Jackson said suddenly, setting down his pen, "that we might expand the medicinal garden next spring. There is that section of hillside we have not yet developed, good south-facing slope, excellent drainage." "I was thinking the same thing," Lily replied, smiling. "I want to try cultivating some of the wild ginger I found in the canyon last month. It has potential as an anti-inflammatory." "The same canyon where I found you, the very same. I finally made it back to collect that evening primrose specimen, by the way. It was exactly the variant I thought. The paper should be published next month." Jackson stood, crossing to where she sat, and took the specimen jar from her hands, setting it carefully aside. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night, when I told you I would carry you?" "I said you could not carry me 7 miles, Lily recalled. "I said it was impossible." "And I said yes, madam, and did it anyway," Jackson replied, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "I have been thinking about that a lot lately, about how many impossible things turn out to be possible if you simply start walking. Is this leading somewhere, Mr. Fuller?" "Just to bed, Miss Carrington," Jackson said, and Lily laughed, the sound bright and free. "It is Mrs. Fuller and has been for 10 years. You would think you would remember." "I remember everything," Jackson said softly, seriously now. "Every step of those 7 miles. Every word we have spoken. Every morning I wake up next to you and think I am the luckiest man alive." Lily reached up to cup his face, this good, patient, extraordinary man who had changed her life by simply doing what he thought was right. "I am the lucky one," she said. "I broke my ankle miles from town and found the only cowboy in the entire West who would carry me home without complaint." "No complaint then," Jackson agreed. "No complaint ever." They climbed the stairs together, Lily's ankle giving only the faintest twinge after all these years, a reminder of the accident that had brought them together. In their bedroom, the one they had shared for a decade now, moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the photograph on the dresser. Their wedding portrait, both of them smiling like they had won the greatest prize in the world. The years continued to unfold with their predictable rhythms and unexpected joys. Caleb grew into a serious boy fascinated by the cattle operation, while James showed his mother's interest in plants and science. Alina proved to be a force of nature, fearless and curious, climbing trees and catching snakes, and asking endless questions about everything she observed. When Caleb was 12, he asked his father about the story of how his parents met, and Jackson told him the whole tale, leaving nothing out, including the part about nearly losing the ranch. "So Mama saved us?" Caleb asked, his young face serious. "We saved each other," Jackson corrected. "Your mother was in trouble and I helped her. Then I was in trouble and she helped me. That is what love is, son. Not one person always carrying the other, but both of you taking turns being strong." Lily, overhearing from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner, felt tears sting her eyes. After all these years, Jackson still found ways to surprise her with his wisdom, with the depth of feeling beneath his quiet exterior. That evening, after the children were in bed, she told him what she had overheard, and Jackson looked embarrassed. "I was just trying to explain it in a way he would understand." "You explained it perfectly," Lily said. "Better than I could have." The ranch continued to prosper, becoming known throughout the territory as a model of diversified agriculture. combining traditional cattle ranching with pharmaceutical crop cultivation in ways that other ranchers began to emulate. Lily's research gained her invitations to speak at universities and medical conferences, though she turned down more than she accepted, unwilling to be away from her family for long periods. Jackson never accompanied her on these trips, content to maintain the ranch and care for the children while she was gone. But he read every paper she published, often offering suggestions that improved her work. He had developed an intuitive understanding of plant ecology from years of observation, and Lily valued his input as much as she valued the feedback from her academic colleagues. When Alina was 7, she fell from a tree and broke her wrist, and Lily watched Jackson carry their daughter into the house with the same careful gentleness he had shown carrying her all those years ago. He stayed up all night with Alina, telling her stories and keeping her distracted from the pain. And in the morning, Lily found them both asleep in the rocking chair, Jackson's arms wrapped protectively around their little girl. "You are so good at this," Lily whispered to him later, after Alina had been examined by Dr. Morrison and pronounced on the mend. "At loving us, at being exactly what we need." "I just do what seems right," Jackson replied, looking genuinely puzzled by the praise. "The same thing anyone would do." "Not anyone," Lily corrected. "You, Jackson, this is who you are." As the children grew, so did the ranch and the botanical business. By the time Caleb was 16, the Fuller Ranch employed a dozen hands and supplied medicinal plants to pharmaceutical companies across the country. The small cabin had been expanded into a proper house, spacious and comfortable, filled with books and specimens and the comfortable clutter of a busy family. Lily published her first book, a comprehensive guide to medicinal plants of the American West, dedicated to Jackson, who carried me home and taught me that the best discoveries are the ones we make together. It became a standard reference work, used in medical schools and by field researchers, and brought her a level of recognition that still felt surreal. But the achievement she was most proud of was not professional. It was the family they had built, the life they had created, the home that felt like the safest place in the world. It was watching Caleb work alongside his father, learning the cattle business with the same patient dedication Jackson showed in everything. It was seeing James bent over a microscope, examining plant specimens with Lily's careful precision. It was Alina's fearless curiosity, the way she approached the world with the confidence of a child who had always been encouraged to ask questions and seek answers. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised Lily with a gift, a new species of wildflower discovered growing in a remote section of the ranch that had been officially named Liliana fulleri in her honor by the Botanical Society. The small purple flower with distinctive white centers was already showing promise as a potential treatment for respiratory ailments. "How did you manage this?" Lily asked, stunned and delighted. "The Botanical Society does not just name plants on request." "I sent them your research on it," Jackson explained, "along with a detailed history of your contributions to the field. They agreed that you deserved the recognition. Dr. Peterson from the San Francisco office said it was long overdue." Lily felt tears streaming down her face, overcome by the thoughtfulness of it, by the fact that Jackson had gone to such effort on her behalf. "You are impossible," she said, laughing through tears. "How am I supposed to match this?" "You already did," Jackson replied, pulling her close. 15 years ago when you stayed. When you chose this life, chose me, chose us. That is the gift, Lily. Every day with you is the gift." The years blurred together in the way they do when life is full and satisfying, marked by the small milestones and large triumphs that make up a well-lived life. Caleb eventually took over the cattle operation, proving to have his father's steady hand and good judgment. James went to university to study botany formally, then returned to work alongside his mother in the research operation. Eleanor, true to her fearless nature, became a veterinarian, the first woman to graduate from the veterinary college in Oregon. Jackson and Lily grew older together, silver threading through their hair, lines deepening around their eyes, but their love never wavered. If anything, it deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the initial passion of those first months. They knew each other completely now, knew every preference and habit and fear, and that knowledge only made them love each other more. On their 25th wedding anniversary, they took a rare trip alone, riding back to the canyon where Jackson had found Lily all those years ago. The evening primrose she had been reaching for when she fell still grew there, and they collected specimens together, working in comfortable harmony. "You ever think about how different our lives would be if I had not fallen that day?" Lily asked, carefully pressing a flower into her specimen book. "If the rock had held, if you had ridden past 5 minutes earlier, all the time," Jackson admitted. "And then I thank whatever Providence brought us together, because I cannot imagine any version of my life without you in it." They made camp that night under the stars, something they had not done in years, and lay together in their bedroll watching the sky wheel overhead. It was not comfortable, not at their age, but it felt important somehow. This return to the place where their story began. "I would do it again," Jackson said suddenly, his voice soft in the darkness. "Carry you 7 miles, sacrifice the auction, risk the ranch. I would make the same choice every time, Lily. Because saving you, meeting you, loving you, those are the things that made my life matter. The ranch, the success, the money, none of that means anything compared to what we built together." Lily turned in his arms, finding his mouth in the darkness, kissing him with all the love and gratitude and fierce joy she felt. "I know," she whispered against his lips. "I know, my love." When they returned home, it was to a house full of family. Caleb and his wife had 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl, filling the ranch with the sound of young voices again. James had married a fellow botanist, and they lived in the cottage near the research lab, working together on new projects. Eleanor visited when she could, bringing stories of her veterinary practice and the animals she treated. On Sunday evenings, they all gathered for dinner, 3 generations around the expanded table, and Jackson would sit at the head of it all, looking around with an expression of deep contentment. This was what he had worked for, what he had built, and it was more than he had ever dreamed possible. Lily, watching him from the other end of the table, would catch his eye and smile, a whole conversation passing between them in that single glance. They had come so far from that night in the canyon, from the desperate walk through the dark and the uncertain future. They had built something lasting, something beautiful, and they had done it together. The autumn of their 30th year of marriage brought an early frost, and Jackson caught a chill while moving cattle to winter pasture. It developed into pneumonia, and for a terrifying week, Lily sat by his bedside remembering every moment of their life together and praying desperately that they would have more time. "You cannot leave me," she told him fiercely, holding his hand while Dr. Morrison looked grave and worried. "We have more to do, Jackson, more years to live. You have to fight this." Jackson, even in his fever, managed to smile. "Yes, madam," he whispered, echoing those words from so long ago, and Lily laughed through her tears. He recovered slowly, stubbornly, with the same patient endurance he brought to everything in life. By Christmas, he was back on his feet, thinner and weaker but definitively on the mend. The scare had shaken them both, a reminder that time was not infinite, that they needed to treasure what they had. "Let us go somewhere," Lily suggested that winter as they sat by the fire in the evening. San Francisco, maybe, or Denver, somewhere we have never been together. Or we could stay right here, Jackson countered, pulling her closer. This is where I want to be, Lily. Home with you, with our family around us. That is my idea of paradise. So they stayed, and the years continued their gentle march forward. They celebrated their grandchildren's birthdays and school achievements, hosted holidays and harvest festivals, maintained the ranch and the research operation with the help of their children. The work was lighter now, delegated to younger hands, but they still rose each morning with purpose, still found joy in the daily routines they had built together. On their 35th anniversary, Jackson surprised Lily by organizing a gathering of all the botanists and researchers she had worked with over the years. They came from across the country, converging on the ranch for a weekend symposium in her honor, presenting papers and sharing research, and celebrating her contributions to the field. Lily, standing before the assembled group in the lecture hall James had built adjacent to the laboratory, looked out at the faces and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "I was told once," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt, "that women had no place in science, that our work would never be taken seriously. Standing here today, seeing all of you, knowing that my research has contributed something meaningful, it feels like vindication. But more than that, it feels like hope. For all the young women who will come after us, who will not have to fight quite so hard for recognition." The applause was thunderous, and when Jackson appeared at her side taking her hand, the applause doubled. Everyone knew the story of how they had met, how Lily's broken ankle had led to the botanical discoveries that had revolutionized medicinal plant research. It was a legend in the field, a reminder that fortune and science often intersect in unexpected ways. That night, after the guests had retired to the guest quarters James had built specifically for this event, Jackson and Lily walked through the medicinal garden under a full moon. The echinacea beds were dormant now, waiting for spring, but the garden was still beautiful, still filled with the promise of growth and discovery. 35 years, Lily marveled, leaning against Jackson's shoulder. How is that possible? It feels like yesterday and forever ago at the same time. The best years of my life, Jackson said simply. Every single one of them. They walked in silence for a while, following the familiar paths through the garden they had created together. Lily thought about that terrified woman with the broken ankle, calling out into the darkness and hoping someone would hear. She thought about the cowboy who had appeared like an answer to prayer, carrying her through the night without complaint. She thought about all the moments that had led them to this place, this life, this love that had sustained them through 3.5 decades. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jackson looked down at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For carrying me," Lily replied. "That night and every day since. For being the man I needed, the partner I dreamed of, the love that made everything else possible." Jackson stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his hands gentle on her face. "Lily Carrington Fuller," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you have carried me just as surely. Through every challenge, every fear, every moment when I doubted myself, you were there. Believing in me, supporting me, loving me. We have carried each other, my love. That is what we do." They kissed there in the moonlight, surrounded by the garden they had planted together, and Lily felt the same rush of joy and certainty she had felt on their wedding day. This was right. This was home. This was everything. The final years of their story unfolded with a gentle sweetness that felt like grace. They watched their grandchildren grow, saw the first of their great-grandchildren born, tended the ranch and the garden with the help of the next generation. The work continued, the research advanced, but it was no longer the center of their lives. That place belonged to each other, to the quiet moments of connection, to the shared memories of a life well lived. Jackson's health remained stable, though he moved slower now, relying more on Caleb and the ranch hands for the physical work. Lily's eyes grew weaker, requiring stronger spectacles for her research, but her mind remained sharp as ever. They adapted to aging with the same patient grace they brought to everything, accepting limitations without complaint, finding new ways to contribute. On their 40th anniversary, they sat together on the porch at sunset, the same place they had stood so many times over the years, watching the light paint the hills in shades of purple and gold. Their children and grandchildren had thrown them a party earlier in the day, filling the house with laughter and love, but now it was just the two of them enjoying the quiet. 40 years, Jackson said wonderingly. When I think about carrying you out of that canyon, I never imagined this. Never imagined we would build something so beautiful. I imagined it, Lily replied, taking his hand. Somewhere around mile 4, when you said no burden, I imagined spending the rest of my life with you, and it has been even better than I dreamed. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of orange and pink. The evening star appeared, bright and steady, and Lily made a wish the way she had as a child, even though she had everything she could possibly want. "What are you wishing for?" Jackson asked, reading her expression. "More time," Lily admitted. 1,000 more sunsets like this one, 1,000 more quiet evenings with you. "Then that is what we will have," Jackson said firmly, as if he could command time itself to slow. "As many as heaven allows, and all of them together." And for a few more precious years, that promise held true. They had more sunsets, more quiet evenings, more mornings waking up next to each other. They had grandchildren's weddings, and the opening of a new wing on the research facility, and the publication of Lily's final book, a memoir that told the story of her life in science and love. When Jackson finally passed, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, with Lily beside him holding his hand, he went with a smile on his face and no regrets in his heart. He had lived a good life, a meaningful life, and he had loved one woman with his whole heart for more than 40 years. Lily grieved him fiercely, the way you grieve when you have lost half of yourself, but she did not despair. She had their children, their grandchildren, the ranch and the garden they had built together. She had decades of memories, every one of them precious. And she had the absolute certainty that she had been loved completely, faithfully, devotedly by the best man she had ever known. She lived another 5 years after Jackson died, continuing the research work, spending time with family, tending the garden. On Sunday evenings, when everyone gathered for dinner, she would sit in Jackson's chair at the head of the table and tell stories about him, making sure the youngest grandchildren knew what kind of man he had been. "Your grandfather," she told them, "was the sort of man who would carry a stranger 7 miles without complaint, who would risk everything to do what was right, who loved with his whole heart. That is the example he left us. That is the legacy we carry forward." When Lily finally followed Jackson, dying peacefully at 78 surrounded by her children, her last words were no burden, and everyone who heard them smiled through their tears, understanding. They buried her beside Jackson on the hillside overlooking the ranch, in the shade of the cottonwood trees they had planted on their 5th anniversary. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and the dates of their lives and a single line beneath. They carried each other home. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, along with the stories of how it had been saved and the love that had built it. The medicinal garden thrived, now a protected historic site and research facility that trained new botanists and herbalists. The Fuller name became synonymous with innovation and integrity in both ranching and botanical research. But more than any professional legacy, Jackson and Lily left behind a family that understood what love looked like. A family that knew the value of patience and kindness, and doing what was right even when it cost you. A family that carried each other through dark times and celebrated together in bright ones. And sometimes, on still evenings when the sunset painted the hills purple and gold, people working in the garden would swear they could hear laughter on the wind, see two figures walking hand in hand through the rows of echinacea. Just shadows, probably, just tricks of light. But maybe, just maybe, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built something lasting and beautiful together, still walked the land they had loved, still held each other close, still carried each other home.